often said that Yitzchak Avinu was the first person born as a Jew. He had the difficult task of continuing Avram's legacy, the great legacy of Hanefesh Asher Asu V'Charan, Vayikra B'Shem Hashem Kel Olam, of spreading the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world, that fell on Yitzchak's shoulders. We would expect that a person in this position of preserving a legacy might be very rigid and do things exactly the same as he learned from his father, his great father who had started this great movement. But we find in a few places in our parsha, Yitzchak Avinu had the agility to change gears, to switch things from the way Avram had done, and we can learn from him how we as well, as Bnei Avram, have to adapt to our circumstances. The first place we see this is when Yitzchak Avinu arrives in Be'er Sheva, after the whole story of Avimelech and Rivka and the Be'eros. So Yitzchak comes back to Be'er Sheva. This is in the beginning of the fourth Aliyah, and the Torah tells us, "Vayiven sham mizbech v'yikra b'shem Hashem v'yacham oholo v'yichru sham v'dei Yitzchak be'er." On the one hand, this pasuk is perhaps the greatest expression of Yitzchak following in the path of Avraham. He builds a mizbeach v'yikra b'shem Hashem. This was Avram Avinu's mission: building mizbachos, calling out in the name of Hashem, teaching the world about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And yet, in this very pasuk, we see how Yitzchak differs from Avraham. When it comes with Avram Avinu, the first time we encounter Avram building Mizbeach is in the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, and there it says, "Vayez aholo beis el miyam v'amikedem, vayiven sham Mizbeach laHashem v'yikra b'shem Hashem." Avram Avinu Davka builds his ohel first, and then builds Mizbeach in order to call out in the name of Hashem. Yitzchak builds Mizbeach to call in the name of Hashem, and then he pitches his tent. When it comes to Avram Avinu, the tent came first, because Avram Avinu, his tent, his midah was chesed. His tent was the way in which he called the name of Hashem. The way in which he spread Hashem's name was to have a tent with hospitality, with teaching people about the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yitzchak Avinu, on the one hand, follows in the path of Avram Avinu. He builds a mizbech to call in the name of Hashem. On the other hand, he understands about himself that he's not the same. He's not a carbon copy of Avram Avinu. His midah is not to be the one performing hospitality and doing chesed for people and calling attention to the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That as well, that's important. But his main focus would be on the Mizbeach, on the Kriya B'Shem Hashem. Chazal say, of davening, some midrashos say, a Beis Medrash. Yitzchak Avinu would call out the name of Hashem, would spread the name of Hashem through his avoda, through his tefillah, and through his Talmud Torah. And that is one way in which we see that Yitzchak Avinu understood himself, that on the one hand, he has a job to preserve the legacy of Avram Avinu. On the other hand, he has to adapt to his own strengths and perform that mission in his own way. And therefore, he builds the Mizbeach first, and then he builds the Ohel after. That's number one. A second place in which we see this in our parsha is in the story with the brachos, with Yitzchak and Esav and Yaakov. That parsha begins, Yitzchak Avinu calls Vayikras Esav b'no hagadol, Vayomer elav b'ni, Vayomer elav hineni. When we hear these words, B'ni and Hineni, our mind immediately goes back to the Akedah. And the Akedah as well begins with a call from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Avram Avinu, V'emei elav Avraham v'yom Hineni. HaKadosh Baruch Hu calls Avram, Avram responds Hineni. Similarly, Yitzchak calls to Esav and he responds Hineni. Why does he call Esav B'no HaGadol? And recalls the next pasuk, V'emar kachnaz ben chaz yichitcha shar havta es Yitzchak. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram Avinu, there's not going to be an event where you're going to, of the two children you have, Yitzchak and Ishmael, you're going to do something that demonstrates the singular relationship you have with one of them. And Yitzchak Avinu as well, he's getting older, it's time to pass on his legacy, and he's going to do something that is going to pass on the legacy to one of the two children, in this case, the Beno HaGadol, Esav. Yitzchak's plan is that Esav is going to be the inheritor, the primary inheritor of his great legacy. And yet, as the story unfolds, we find another reference to the Akedah. When Yaakov Avinu walks into the room, Vayavo el aviv, vayomer avi, vayomer hineni, mi ata b'ni. This pasuk is startling in how it reminds us of another pasuk in the Akedah. When Avraham and Yitzchak are walking together, Vayomer Yitzchak al Avraham avi, vayomer hineni v'ni. Avram Avinu responds to Yitzchak, Hineni v'ni. When Yitzchak had called to him Avi, so too Yitzchak responds to Yaakov, Hineni mi ata bini, when Yaakov calls out him Avi. And perhaps what the Psukim are alluding to is that Yitzchak Avinu, in the course of this story with Esav and the brachos, he had a plan. He thought that yes, the time has come to pass on my legacy, the time has come to designate an heir, and he assumed it would be Esav. And as a person whose job in life, whose mission in life was to preserve and pass on the great legacy of his father, we could imagine there'd be a rigid line of succession. He received from Abraham, and his oldest son, that's who's going to receive next. But in the course of this story, the brachos, Yitzchak comes to realize that actually Yaakov is the one. He has the agility to realize that something needs to change. The legacy that he received from Avraham Avinu is going to go to Yaakov. And perhaps these psukim that allude to the relationship between Avraham and Yitzchak and demonstrate that there's a similar relationship between Yitzchak and Yaakov show us how Yitzchak was able to transition and come to realize that indeed Yaakov was the one who would inherit. So from these two places, both from the order in which he built the Mizbeach and his Ohel, and from the way in which he related to his sons Esav and Yaakov, we see Yitzchak Avinu emerging as the Av of transition, the Av of preservation, and the Av who understood that how preservation and transition go together. Be'ez Hashem, we in our lives need to understand as well that we are Bnei Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We have a great legacy that we need to preserve. We also need to understand how to pass it on in our door, how it applies to us individually and our door as a whole. Have a wonderful Shabbos.